Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. We are diving deep into a classic today, 1984 by George Orwell.
Yeah.
And we're going to be using some really insightful YouTube reviews and a scholarly newspaper review to unpack all of the themes of this dystopian masterpiece. So
Absolutely.
even if you've read this book before, you're in for some fresh perspectives.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that's so fascinating about 1984 is how relevant it remains, you know? This world of perpetual war, omnipresent surveillance, and thought control.
Yeah.
It still hits a nerve even decades after it was published.
Definitely.
And these sources, they really point to some interesting reasons why that is.
Okay, so let's set the scene for our listeners.
Okay.
We are in Oceania, a totalitarian state that's ruled by the ever-watchful Big Brother
Right.
and the mysterious party.
Yes.
Individuality is crushed, history is rewritten, and even your thoughts are policed.
It's pretty chilling, and Orwell constructs this vision with incredible detail.
Yeah.
The Iowa State Daily Review called Oceania the Epitome of Totalitarianism,
Wow.
and really emphasizes this complete subordination
Yeah.
of its citizens. You know what makes 1984 so powerful, though?
What's that?
Is that Orwell reveals the psychological mechanisms of oppression. Like, it's not just brute force.
Right.
It's about exploiting human weaknesses
Yeah.
and manipulating the way people think.
Yeah, and that is where our protagonist, Winston Smith, comes in.
Yes.
At first glance, he just seems like your average guy, you know,
Right.
just trying to survive in this really oppressive system.
Yeah.
Alex Blackreed even calls him an everyman figure.
Yeah, he does. That's a good point. But the more we learn about Winston, the more we realize that he's not so ordinary after all.
Okay.
He questions the party's authority,
Right.
and he even rebels against it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that leads to his downfall.
Oh, good point. We will discuss his ultimate fate a little later.
We will.
But first, we have to talk about one of the most ingenious and disturbing elements
Yes.
of 1984, and that is Newspeak.
Newspeak. This is where Orwell really gets into the power of language.
Yeah.
You know, the party creates Newspeak to limit thought by actually shrinking the vocabulary.
Wow.
They believe that if you can't express an idea,
Yeah.
you can't even think it.
It's terrifying.
It's a scary thought. And they have words like doublethink, which means holding two completely contradictory beliefs at the same time,
Oh, yeah.
and thought crime, where even thinking the wrong thing is a punishable offense.
It's crazy.
It really is. And the Medium Review picks up on that.
Okay.
They argue that language shapes the way we think.
Yeah.
And if we're not careful, we can be manipulated by the words that we use and consume. So it really makes you think about the language that we encounter every single day in the media, in politics,
Everywhere.
even in advertising.
Yeah, it's true. So Winston is not only struggling with the party's control, but he's also grappling with his own emotions and desires.
Of course.
Enter Julia and a forbidden love affair
Yes.
in the midst of this oppressive regime.
That's right.
Now, this is where we see some differing opinions from our YouTubers.
Yeah.
Eric Hill Reviews points out that Winston and Julia's love story,
Okay.
which is doomed from the start, highlights a really sad truth about human nature. We often choose comforting lies
Yeah.
over painful realities.
That's very true.
So even in this dystopian world, people crave
Right.
connection and love, even if it's an illusion.
Absolutely. But Alex Blackreed's has a different take.
Okay.
They actually question whether the romance was even necessary for the story,
Interesting.
suggesting that it might even distract from the powerful world building
Okay.
that Orwell has created.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the purpose of the romance
Yeah.
within the larger narrative.
Right.
Is it a symbol of hope or distraction from the bleak reality of Oceania?
Perhaps it's both.
Yeah.
And I think that that ambiguity is part of what makes 1984 so compelling.
Yeah, I agree. But before we delve further into the complexities of Winston and Julia's relationship, let's take a quick pause.
Okay.
If you're enjoying this deep dive into the world of 1984 so far,
Yes.
don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a review.
We love hearing your thoughts.
All right, now let's brace ourselves
Okay.
and face the darkness.
All right.
It's time to talk about the ending of 1984.
Yes. Things take a very dark turn for Winston.
Yeah.
He's captured by the thought police,
Oh, no.
tortured,
Oh, gosh.
and ultimately...
Betrays Julia.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
It is. And the Iowa State Daily Review reminds us that Big Brother really thrives on exploiting people's deepest fears
Right.
and vulnerabilities. And that brings us to one of the most iconic and disturbing scenes in the book.
Oh, yeah.
The rat torture.
The rat torture. It's visceral. It's an unforgettable moment.
Yeah.
But Alex Blackreeds argues that it feels almost trivial.
Interesting.
Compared to the systematic psychological manipulation that Winston has already endured.
I see what they mean. We've already seen him broken down.
Yes.
Mentally and emotionally.
Right.
So does the rat torture really add anything to the story?
Well, maybe that's precisely Orwell's point.
Okay.
Maybe he's showing us that even our most primal fears can be weaponized.
Wow.
And that no matter how strong we think we are, there's always a way to break us.
That's a chilling thought.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests that even seemingly insignificant fears can be exploited when they're manipulated effectively.
Absolutely. That's the brilliance of 1984. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the potential for power to corrupt, even in subtle ways.
Yeah, speaking of uncomfortable truths, one of our YouTubers, Eric Hill Reviews, brought up an interesting comparison between 1984 and another dystopian classic. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Right.
Both of them explore totalitarian societies, but they have very different approaches to control.
That's right. Brave New World presents a world where people are controlled through pleasure and distraction rather than fear and oppression.
So it's a really fascinating contrast to Orwell's vision.
It is.
And Eric Hill Reviews argues that while Brave New World might be a more accurate prediction of the future, 1984 just offers a better story.
Interesting. What do you think?
I don't know. That's a great question for our listeners to ponder.
It is.
Which scenario feels more likely in our own world?
Right.
And what does that say about us?
Exactly. It's a debate that's raged on for decades.
Yeah.
Which dystopia is more plausible, more terrifying. But ultimately, both 1984 and Brave New World serve as warnings.
Yeah.
They urge us to be vigilant against any force that seeks to erode freedom and individual thought.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
We have to be aware of those things.
Yeah, and that brings us to another important point. Even though both of these dystopian novels paint a pretty bleak picture, they're ultimately meant to be warnings, not predictions.
Exactly. They're designed to make us think critically about the world around us. And recognize the subtle ways in which our freedom can be chipped away.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful tools for doing that is language.
Yeah.
Remember that chilling line from 1984, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past.
Yeah, it's all about controlling the narrative, right?
It is the party in 1984.
Yeah.
They're constantly rewriting history to fit their agenda.
Right.
And they use Newspeak to make it impossible to even question the official version of events.
Yeah, that's right. They understand that if you control the language, you control the way people think.
Exactly. And this isn't just a dystopian fantasy either. We see examples of this kind of language manipulation all the time. In propaganda, advertising, even political discourse.
Oh, it's so true.
Yeah.
Think about how certain words are used to evoke specific emotions or to frame an issue in a particular way. We're constantly bombarded with messages that are designed to influence our thinking. And it's easy to fall prey to that manipulation if we're not careful.
That's why it's so important to be critical consumers of information.
Yeah.
We need to question the sources we rely on, look for evidence to support the claims we encounter, and be willing to consider different perspectives.
It's like being our own Winston in a way, sifting through the propaganda, trying to uncover the truth.
Exactly.
We have to be vigilant and question everything.
And that's something that the Medium Review emphasizes as well. They talk about the importance of engaging with diverse perspectives, even those we might disagree with. Because it forces us to challenge our own assumptions and to see the world in a more nuanced way.
Yeah. It's about getting out of our own echo chambers. Exposing ourselves to different ideas, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Yes.
Because the truth, as they say, is often somewhere in the middle.
That's right. Yeah. And it's not just about being right or wrong. It's about being open to learning and growing. It's about recognizing that our understanding of the world is constantly evolving. And we need to be flexible enough to adapt to new information and perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway for our listeners. Engaging in critical thinking and seeking out diverse viewpoints are essential for navigating the complexities of the world we live in.
It's true.
It's the best defense against falling prey to manipulation and control.
And let's not forget the human element in all of this.
Okay.
As Winston's story shows us, we're all susceptible to the seductive nature of comfort and security.
Right.
Sometimes it's just easier to cling to familiar lies than to confront painful truths.
It's a tough lesson, but a valuable one. And it makes you think, what would Orwell say about our world today?
That is a good question.
You know, he wrote in 1984 in a time before the internet, racial media, and the constant flow of information we experience now.
It's hard to say for sure, but I think his warnings about surveillance, thought control, and the manipulation of truth feel even more relevant now than ever before.
Yeah, he might be surprised by the technology.
Right.
But I think he'd recognize the underlying patterns of power and control.
Absolutely. And that's why 1984 continues to resonate with readers today.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the fight for freedom of thought and expression is ongoing.
Right.
And we all have a role to play in that fight.
We can't be passive observers. We have to be active participants.
That's right.
In shaping the world that we want to live in.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to another important point.
Okay.
Even though 1984 presents this dystopian vision, it's not a prediction of the future.
Right.
It's a warning.
It is.
A call to action.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we have the power to choose a different path.
Yes.
To create a world where individual freedom and critical thinking are valued and protected.
And one way to do that is by being informed, engaged citizens who are willing to question authority.
Yes.
And stand up for what we believe in.
That's right. And that includes supporting initiatives that promote freedom of expression, challenging censorship, and advocating for transparency and accountability from those in power.
We can also choose to be mindful of the language that we use.
Yes.
And consume, recognizing the ways in which it can be used to manipulate and control us.
Absolutely.
And we can make a conscious effort to engage with diverse perspectives.
Yes.
Even those we might find challenging, to broaden our understanding of the world and resist the temptation to retreat into our own echo chambers.
All of these actions, big and small,
they
contribute to creating a society that values individual freedom and critical thinking.
Right.
And that's the best way to ensure that the dystopian vision of 1984 never becomes our reality.
Well said. And speaking of taking action, if you're enjoying this deep dive into 1984, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a review.
We love hearing from our listeners.
And before we wrap up our discussion of this thought-provoking novel, we have one more important theme to explore: the impact of isolation and illness on Orwell's writing. We were just talking about how 1984 is such a powerful warning against totalitarianism and the erosion of individual freedoms. But it's also fascinating to consider the context in which Orwell wrote this masterpiece.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that Orwell wrote 1984 while he was battling tuberculosis.
Oh, wow.
In relative isolation on a remote Scottish island.
Yeah, Eric Hill reviews even mentioned that he didn't have electricity or hot water during that time.
Yeah, it was a pretty stark existence.
Talk about a recipe for bleakness.
Right.
It makes you wonder how much his personal circumstances influenced the dark tone of the novel.
It's certainly something to consider. You know, does Orwell's isolation and illness make his warning even more potent?
Right.
Or does it raise questions about whether his vision was overly pessimistic?
It's a tough question to answer definitively, but I think it's safe to say that Orwell's personal struggles probably contributed to the intensity and urgency of his message.
I think so. He had witnessed firsthand the horrors of totalitarianism during his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
And he was deeply concerned about the rise of authoritarianism in the post-World War II era.
And his experiences combined with his declining health likely fueled his desire to warn future generations about the dangers of unchecked power.
Right.
And the importance of safeguarding individual liberties.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that great works of literature often emerge from these periods of personal struggle and hardship.
Yeah.
And it makes 1984 even more poignant knowing that Orwell poured his heart and soul into it while facing his own mortality.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is important to remember, though, that 1984 is ultimately a work of fiction.
Right.
Not a prophecy. It's a cautionary tale.
It is.
Not a blueprint for the future. And while it's definitely a bleak and disturbing novel, it also offers a glimmer of hope.
I think you're right. Even in the face of overwhelming oppression, Winston Smith clings to that belief that the human spirit and the desire for freedom can never be completely extinguished.
That's a good point. And ultimately, that's the message we should take away from 1984.
It is. We have the power to shape our own destiny. We can choose to be informed, engaged citizens who fight for freedom of thought and expression.
Yes.
We can choose to resist manipulation and control. We can choose to create a world where Big Brother never comes to pass.
And I think that's a great note to end on.
It is.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of 1984. We hope this discussion has given you some new insights into this timeless classic.
Yes.
And inspired you to think critically about the world around you.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure exploring these thought-provoking sources with you and our listeners.
And if you're ready to experience Orwell's masterpiece for yourself, be sure to check out the link in the description to get your own copy of 1984.
And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review. We always love hearing from our listeners.
Thanks for listening.